So let's go through the upper class first. And we are going to cover the 7 major characteristics of the upper class. So the first thing that we want to talk about is their income. How much money are they making? Keep in mind, income is just one of many features. Most people have a tendency to overestimate the extent to which income matters in terms of class. So we're going to say over $500,000 a year, $500,000 a year. That would be a typical upper class income. Their jobs tend to be things like corporate managers, CEOs, highly paid entertainers and celebrities, but the bulk of these upper class people are often people who are heirs. An heir is someone who inherits money and subsequently manages that money that they have inherited. Um, this group is about 1 to 2% of the population. When you hear people talk about the top 1%, they're talking about the upper class. So, in terms of level of education, um, most people in the upper class are going to have a college degree. Not necessarily graduate school or PhDs or master's degrees. They don't really need that to be well off, right? Upper class people, because many of them inherit this or they're born into intergenerational wealth, they don't need to have a very high level of education. In terms of their children's education, their children are also probably going to go to college, and many of them are going to go to very elite, very expensive private schools, maybe Ivy League schools. Many of them will get in there based on what we call legacy admissions. In a legacy admission, if your parents went to this place, then you can subsequently get a sort of bounce up or extra consideration in your application. So a lot of those people end up at places like Harvard or Princeton. They might not be the smartest kid, but because their parents went there, because they might have gone to a boarding school or an elite private school for high school and elementary school, they also may have counselors who are helping them extensively to write applications. These kids are not generally going to public schools. That's not the most common thing in the upper class. So, the other thing to think about with them is their homes. What kind of homes do upper class people live in? So, upper class people are going to have very lavish homes. They may have multiple homes. A lot of them are going to have very expensive homes in prime locations. So, for example, you might have your Manhattan apartment and your house in the Hamptons. You might have your Georgetown or San Francisco townhouse or condominium, and then you have a beach house as well. So what we see is that their homes are expensive. They're in multiple locations, often prime locations in maybe urban or suburban centers or lakefront, beachfront type places. The next characteristics that we would want to talk about with the upper class is their division of household labor. Who's doing the work in the house? For the most part, upper class people, while they may do some of their work, they can afford to pay people to do that work for them. So maybe they have a nanny, maybe they have a maid, maybe they have a chef, maybe they have a housekeeper who comes in and lives permanently and has their own quarters in the back. They might have a gardener or a driver. They may spend a lot of time, in fact, away from their kids because their nanny does a lot of the care for their children. And that's a common thing we see among upper class people. Upper class people don't really spend a lot of time with things like childcare. They usually have other people doing that. I was thinking about this yesterday. Here we are in the middle of this pandemic, and some of you all may have seen these concert videos from some of your favorite artists from home. I happened to see the John Legend concert on Instagram Live, and here I'm coming to you from my humble lower middle class living room, and I was watching John Legend coming to you live with Chrissy Teigen his wonderful wife sitting in what looked like a towel dress. I couldn't really tell. And their daughter sitting on this fancy piano in this upper class home, much more lavish than what you would see with someone like me. All right, let's talk about the upper middle class. The upper middle class, they're going to have incomes ranging anywhere from like $100,000 all the way up to $500,000. Again, that's a range. It might be different in different locations. What kind of jobs are the upper middle class going to have? They're going to be dentists. They're going to be doctors. They're going to be research scientists. They're going to be highly paid professionals. They might have an MBA and be a mid-level manager in a business. They might have a PhD and be a research scientist. They might have a law degree and be a lawyer. The upper middle class makes up about 15 to 20% of the U.S. population. Out of all of the social classes, this is the most educated social class. They tend to have a bachelor's degree, and many of them are going to have graduate school, PhDs, MBA, and all of these other types of education. Their children, even though many of them are comfortable and have enough money, their children are going to go to public schools for the most part. And those public schools are going to be in communities that are very comfortable communities, very well-funded public schools, highly qualified teachers. The students are going to tend to perform very well. Out of all of the social classes, the upper middle class is the one that's sort of, I would argue, obsessed, maybe to a fault, with getting education and getting degrees, although it's understandable because for them, that's their opportunity to, have a comfortable, well-off lifestyle. So their kids would go to public high school, public elementary school. Maybe some of them would go to private school. Maybe if they didn't particularly like the public school, their kid had some sort of disability issue or some kind of extenuating circumstances, but it's a minority who are going to do that. Many of them are going to send their kids to college. They'll want their kids to go there and achieve. Most of them are going to send their kids to, it depends on how well of an academic performer the child is. The child may end up going to a flagship state institution, which would be the primary best known public institution in their state. For example, here it's University of Maryland. If I was back in Ohio, it might be Ohio State University. If I was in Connecticut, where I got my PhD, it would be University of Connecticut. And so what we see is they may send their kids there. They may also send their kids, if they have good enough grades, to a private school. Might even be able to get into one of these elite private schools, but for the most part, it might be a slightly lower tier, maybe not an Ivy League private school, but a private school that has a pretty good reputation, that and one that they can ultimately afford, because college will be, most of them can afford to pay for their kids' college, but it might be a bit of a financial burden for some upper middle class people. So what kind of homes would they have? Most upper middle class people have what one of my students jokingly called McMansions. So what do I mean by a McMansion, or what did my student mean by that? That means they have a home that is, probably a pretty large home, 2,000, 3,000 square feet, a finished basement, 2-car garage, 4 or 5 bedrooms, 4 or 5 bathrooms in their house, maybe some land and a well manicured lawn out front. They may have, in this suburban DC area where we are, they may have one of the newer townhomes in a prime location, like in the Rio or some of those areas there. Household labor. Who's doing the work? Well, in most upper middle class families, the bulk of the work is done by the mom. Cooking, the cleaning, a lot of the other work will be done by mom. They may have some paid labor. They might have a maid that comes in once a week. A lot of times, if it's a dual income, dual professional couple, they will have childcare with maybe a nanny, maybe they'll go to a daycare, they might pay the neighbor kid to mow their lawn. But most of the work will be done by them with a decent amount of help from people they're paying. The last thing to think about too with that is the children. Are the children doing work? And the children of the upper class and the upper middle class are kind of notorious for not doing very much work. So when we think about upper middle class kids, what are they doing? Well, they're studying for their SATs, they're doing violin and having tennis lessons, and there's a tendency to have them very highly, what I would call, over-scheduled, and often upper middle class families will brag about that oh, my kid he can't do work around the house because he has to do his soccer games and his violin practice and SAT prep, and so we don't have time for him to be doing dishes. So the emphasis is more on the kids doing schoolwork and less on them doing household work.
This video was edited by Lena, credit me,